World Image 4426 says, greetings.
Greetings and welcome to Informal Logic, Fallacies, Bias, and Inductive Errors. And again, this is from the book from Douglas Walton, preeminent scholar in the fields of informal logic and argumentation. Strangely enough, I guess it is an actual field. Nevertheless, we're going to get started with this. Before we do, just remind everyone that this is part of an ongoing series on informal logic. Up until now, we've pretty much just been making the distinctions and the foundations of informal logic and what distinguishes it from the formal logic, the straight, formal, rigid way of dealing with logic. And this one here is now getting into the part where we're incorporating all of the elements we've learned before from that and taking it into where the fine lines of informal logic really come into play. And that's where its applications in our regular day-to-day dialogues that have higher value and risks really come into play. That said, although this might be a graduate level study that we're looking at here, I've taken some time to prepare it into a presentation that should be easy enough for anyone to understand, even an elementary school student, which actually this would be the curriculum of in the different time, considering this is really the culmination of the trivium with logic, rhetoric, and grammar all combined to be able to incorporate the logic, the symbology, and the rigid structure of formal logic, along with grammar and rhetoric, to give us the informal logic and ways to deal with questions and answers and dialogues and such. But in that process, we run into problems, and that's what we're going to start looking at here, the fallacies, the bias, and the errors in induction, which are the root of the problems that arise from informal logic, whereas deductive logic has a certain certainty behind it. That said, I hope enough people have gotten notification. I'm still waiting. That's why I'm just going on. We can always edit this part out. Oh, and there it goes. Notification on, so we're good to go. Let's get started. All right. So first of all, let's get an introduction into inductive reasoning. So the inductive reasoning is a deductively valid argument. The premises are true. If the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. In an inductively strong argument, if the premises are true, it is probable or likely that the conclusion is true. So in deductively valid argument, the conclusion must be true. In an inductively strong argument, it's highly probable or likely that the conclusion is true. So again, we have terms like must be true here, and this one is probably or likely that it's true. So that's the big distinction here. And in that's where all the, when the rubber meets the road for the inductive reasoning, this is where things can go awry. That's what we're going to start to look at here. Now there's deductive validity, meaning that the conclusion must be true if the premises are true. But with inductive reasoning, we have inductive strength, not validity, but strength. The conclusion is probably true if the premises are true. So again, our conclusion is only a probability, it's not a certainty. There's three types of inductive arguments. We have inductive generalization, from the specific to larger group. That's one that most people are about the only one they'll probably teach you in grammar school. Then there's statistical argument, uses percentages, statistical terms, which takes a little bit of mathematical training, which would be beyond this here. And then the causal argument, looking at causality. So judgments of causality between events. Did one event cause another? So anyways, the goal of this presentation here is to understand the criticisms through critical questions. Let's get started here. So, first part is the meaningless and unknowable statistics. The error of meaningless statistics occurs where a statistical claim uses a vague term that is so imprecisely defined that the use of a precise statistical figure in the claim is meaningless. 90% of all statistics are made up on the spot. Okay, so meaningless statistics, precise figure used with vague term. 90% of major racketeers. It's a racketeer. Unknowable statistics, evidence impossible to verify. The average number of kisses before marriage. There's spurious accuracy. An exact figure conveys false precision. And then there's critical questions. How was the data collected? How are terms defined? So these are a critical question. How and why? And the error is presenting weak argument as stronger than evidence warrants. That is the error right there, overstating. And at the very least. Okay, let's continue. So here's an example of meaningless statistics. And we're going to get into more distinction here with these terms. Meaningless statistics coming into this, where it's being mostly overstated is the value of it is applying to the precise value, precise quantity. So 90%, there's your precision there, of major racketers, and right away we get to the imprecision, the more abstract, would be out of business by the end of the year. Another very distinct quantity like 90%, but now we're talking about business of racketeers, which is very vague. If the ordinary citizen, the businessman, the union official, and the public authority stood up to be counted and refused to be corrupted, which is another vague action here. So here's a classic example of meaningless statistics because the term major racketeers is vaguely defined. The precise figure 90% creates false precision. How would one identify and count all major racketeers since they know 90%? How would you count them? There's your question, critical question. The statistic appears authoritative, but it lacks verifiable evidence. Verifiable evidence. Let's continue. Here's another example of unknown statistics. The American girl kisses an average of 79 men before getting married. This is a classic example of unknowable statistic because, well, of course, a gentleman never tells, so how would you ever know? The privacy concerns make accurate data collection impossible. Memory reliability, issues with recalling past kisses. I think former President Bill Clinton had this problem. Definitional problems with what counts as a kiss. I think that was also from Mr. Clinton. And sampling challenges for all American girls. Who wants to take that challenge and be the sampler? How many times have you been kissed? You'll end up with more smacks, I think. So an example here is unknowable statistics, part 2. According to Seligman, 1961, newspaper feature writers have claimed for years that there are 8 million rats. Ooh, that took a long time to count. In New York City. This sounds impressive, but how would you know that this figure is correct? Seligman interviewed the rodent and insect consultant for New York City and was referred to 2 studies. The investigators counted rats in certain areas and then extrapolated from these findings to figures for the whole city. But how could one be confident that even the original counts could be accurate or representative of the rat population of an area? The problem is that the rats do not tend to be too cooperative. They tend to stick to inaccessible places like sewers, and they are not too willing to stand around and be counted like the good businessman was supposed to do against corruption. You can count a rat on the 8th floor of a building and another on the 7th floor, and then when you get to the 6th, but after all, you may be just seeing the same rat 3 times. So we have methodological flaws, counting in limited areas, extrapolating to the entire city, and inaccessible counting locations not being included. Then we have behavioral challenges. Rats are not cooperative. They don't like to fill out questionnaires either. Movement between locations, they don't want to stay in one place. So there's the potential of double counting, or in this case, triple counting. Then there's a false precision. An exact figure appears authoritative. There's your key. Impossibility of verification. So statistically, the uncertainty is ignored. See, so they're giving you a statistic, but it's the statistical uncertainty is being ignored. All right, let's move along here. So now let's look at our sampling procedures. A sampling procedure is a way of drawing things from a certain population having a certain property and then generalizing from the properties of the things in the sample to the properties of the things in the whole population. So as you can see from these quotes from the text here, this is why we're not doing a straight reading of it. It's a very well written text, but it's written kind of for the graduate student. And until you really break it down and parse it into these elements here, it's hard to get through. I'll say that, and that's why I felt the content was so important to bring here to the audience. Yet it wasn't really accessible to most. So hopefully this presentation brings the points there. And just make sure the chat is working here. Let's see if the speaking chat is working here.
The tribe says, hit the like.
Indeed, looks like it is. All right, let's proceed. So in our sampling procedures, when we're pulling these samplings, like counting rats, whatever it may be, there's a representative sample. It's the key to reasonable sampling. So we need to make sure it's representative. Go into the sewers, right? Simple random sample. Each sample of same size has equal chance. So there's a simple sample of each same size of the sample. This is key. There's a stratified random sample where independent samples from each stratum, for instance, adults versus baby elephants. So those you have a sample of adults, take a small sample, say 5 of a herd of the adults and 5 of the babies. That would be stratifying the samples. Campbell's concept. If sample items are chosen at random from the total population, the sample will tend to have the same characteristics in approximately the same proportion as the entire population. I have to say here, though, random is a loaded term here. Inductive reasoning, based on probability, not direct observation. So based on probability, not on direct observation. So even a sample, it's extrapolated to become a probability of something being that way. But if it's presented that it's a distinct count of something from a sample and extrapolated, then that's a misrepresentation. So again, overstating. One thing I did want to point out there is that even when we talk about chose at random, there's even mathematical formulas for ensuring that you're getting, even using the word randomness isn't appropriate, but a adequately distributed sample that can be used for the further calculations. And believe it or not, some of these formulas that have been worked out over many years actually work rather well over large lots. It's amazing. So some of these things that we're learning here in these concepts can be applied both, back into the mathematical realm or forward into the dialogue and the rhetoric. Let's continue here. Yeah, there we are. So insufficient and biased statistics. The criticism of insufficient statistics should be raised where the sample selected is so small that the generalization to the whole population may be virtually worthless. When we say population, we're talking about the population of the entire set that we're considering and taking a sample of that full population. So the insufficient statistics. The sample is too small to rule out chance. So it means that, out of a million things you take out two, you're not going to be able to rule out chance. The bias statistics. Sample is not representative of the population. You just pick the ones on the edge that are easy to get to, low-hanging fruit, so to speak. Sample size factors. The population variability affects adequacy. So the population variability affects adequacy. This is another key point here when we get to statistics is variability. However, I'm digressing. Again, this is part of the sample size. It's a very well-developed area of statistical math when it comes to that and inventory science. Once again, I digress. So critical questions. Is sample size information provided? So they give you, see, in a really good study, all this is provided as a matter of course. And when you're just reading it in something in the regular, the mass media and things like that, they're not going to give you all of that hard data. However, it should be referenced somewhere so that if you did want to go and verify, you could. Is the size adequate for the generalization? So we want to know the population, and then we want to know the sample size, and is it adequate? And does the sample meet representative assumptions? Should that sample have been stratified? If we're just saying, are all animals large, and we're measuring baby elephants and big elephants, and you're comparing them to all adult horses, then you could get confused in that result once it's averaged out. So again, the representative assumptions need to be taken into consideration. Let's continue. So here's another example, the Literary Digest poll. In 1936, the Literary Digest mailed out 10 million ballots in 1936. In a political poll to try to predict whether Franklin Roosevelt, or Alfred Landon would win in the upcoming election. You get the wrong picture in this one. How'd that happen? According to the 2,300,000 ballots returned, it was predicted there's 10 million out, but they got 2,300,000 returned. It was predicted that Landon would win by a clear majority. I don't remember President Landon. The names for the poll were randomly selected from the telephone book. Remember those things? Lists of the magazine's own subscribers and lists of automobile owners. Oh, 1936. Here's our sampling bias. The sample drawn from wealthier Americans who could afford phones, magazines, and cars back in 1936. Overrepresented Republican voters during the Great Depression and excluded lower-income voters who supported Roosevelt. The result, the poll predicted Landon victory. Actual result, Roosevelt won in a landslide. The Literary Digest discredited and went out of business. Yep, I don't remember seeing them anymore. So we see right there how that works with poor sampling, having the sampling bias. All right, long. All right, now we have questionable questions and definitions. Where data are collected by polls or surveys that direct questions to the respondents, the exact wording of those questions may be significant, as we know from loaded questions. So we have question, the wording. It significantly affects the survey results. There's things like vague terms that lead to misleading data, ownership of stock. Does this include mutual funds? Then there's definitions, statistical claims influenced by term definitions, so poverty levels. That varies by country and over time. And as we all know, the loaded questions, slanted to produce the desired response. The unreasonable dichotomy forces a choice between two options. So do you come to the Tribe channel because it's great content or because you love these presentations? So you can give a dichotomy here that really locks people into two choices, which might not be the one that's the of their choosing. Then we have examples, questionable survey questions. So here's some right here. Do you believe that the gospel miracles are mostly historical facts, mostly the gospel writer's interpretation, or mostly legends? Choose one. See that? That's questionable. Then would you you have to choose one of these three. It can't be anything else, or it can't be a combination. See why it's questionable? Then would you approve or disapprove? Here's your dichotomy of a merger of the Episcopal Anglican Church and the Roman Catholic Church. So no conditions, no variance, no shades of gray, just approve or disapprove. And here's another one. In general, do you think the Episcopal Church is too trendy or old-fashioned? So throw in some loaded language there, huh? So we had the false dichotomy. It forces respondents into limited options when more nuanced answers exist. We have the vague terms. Mostly and to lack clear definitions, leading to subjective interpretations like many. So the mostly's and the generalese, not only are they vague, but they're also a bit presumptuous, which takes us to loaded language. Terms like trendy and old-fashioned carry emotional connotations. All right, I hope everyone's staying here because we're going to have a quiz at the end. So we have the post hoc argument. Post hoc. The traditional post hoc fallacy was said to be the unjustified argument that concludes that one event causes another event simply because there is a positive correlation between the two events. There's a correlation, but not a causation. So the post hoc, ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this. So if we saw that this is a logical expression, we'd see why it's not valid. Concluding causation from correlation alone. But it's not inherently fallacious, because positive correlation can be good evidence for a causal relation. So it can be used as evidence, but it's not the causal relationship itself. The error is leaping too quickly to causal conclusion without considering other factors, which we'll be getting into. There's a psychological tendency. Creating logical completion of event sequence makes us prone to post hoc errors. And in fact, I think anthropologists, some of the ones that studied the primates found that this is the most common fallacy found in monkeys, the post hoc. Let's move along. So here's an example of the post hoc coincidence. Every time I wash the car, it starts to rain shortly afterwards. Therefore, my car washing activities are causing outbursts of precipitation in the clouds, like a rain dance. The fallacy: correlation does not equal causation. Confirmation bias, noticing only confirming instances. Not all the times it rained when he didn't wash the car. With small sample size, unless he washes the car every day. Insufficient evidence. Key here is insufficient evidence when we have this kind of post hoc. Why we fall for it? Well, there's the pattern recognition. Our brains seek connections. It gives us the illusion of control, the desire to influence outcomes. And memory bias, remembering coincidences, they stand out. And we have the critical questions. How many times has it happened? How many times do you wash a car and it rained shortly afterwards? What about the times it didn't rain, the negative ones? So we're looking at the different permutations of the logical expression. Is there a plausible mechanism? Can you explain it, not just describe it? Here's another example of a post hoc plausible completion. taxi carrying a lawyer through a busy city street was forced to come to a fast stop behind another taxi, which had also stopped quickly. Through the car window, the lawyer saw the back door of the taxi in front had swung open, and at the same time, he noticed an older man fall through the open door and lay unconscious on the concrete on the street. The next day, reading about the accident in the newspaper, he found that his observations had been wrong. What had really happened was the old man had crossed the street without looking, and the car had braked to avoid hitting him, resulting in a collision that knocked him down. So, we see here the plausible completion here. The initial perception was a sequence of events was observed. There was a causal connection assumed and a logical completion of the story. It was plausible. But the error was a misinterpretation of the cause-effect, the limited perspective of the observer, because the lawyer's in the back seat of a taxi, and the complex causal chain was being oversimplified. Key insight: the correlation did not equal the causation. There were hidden variables at play, and there was multiple perspective needed to reveal the truth. And here's an example of post hoc in scientific debate. You see this one a lot. So pay attention here. According to a new study in the Journal of American Psychiatry, the number of SSRI prescriptions for pediatric depression, ages 5 to 18, tumbled more than 50% between 2003 and 5. In a troubling parallel development, the number of teen suers jumped a record of 18% between 2003 and 2004, the most recent year for which data exists. So, try and make this correlation to this time with that. So let's look here. They're making these claims, dropping 50% in the prescriptions. Post hoc interpretation. Well, I'm sorry, let's look at this here. And then they're saying that this decrease of 50% during this time is the cause of the increase here within this time. So, here's a post hoc interpretation. There's a temporal correlation. It suggests causation. There's a decreased prescriptions and there's increased sewers. So, we see there is some type of correlation here. The policy implications for the antidepressant use. So now there's implications here that could be emotional and otherwise. So, and well, financial. And then we have potential errors. The confounding variables are not considered. No other confounding variables, just this simple oversimplistic causation they're claiming. There's a time lag between prescription changes and effects, and we don't see that here. And there's a small sample size or limited data. And the critical questions we have here are, what other factors influenced the rates? Was there a common cause for both trends? Were they independent? And so there's not even a true correlation there, a coincidence perhaps. How reliable is the data collection? So this one here tumbled more than 50%, and this number here, most recent year for which data exists. And it all comes from a journal, but it doesn't say who collected these studies, this data, and how accurate, what kind of margin of errors we have. They're using the same percentage, but how off could it be? So you see all the questions presented here. These are our critical questions we have to ask, because you don't have to be a scientific expert to question the scientific ad hoc fallacy or post hoc fallacies. There are 6 kinds of post hoc errors. So believe me, it's not going to be much worse after this. Please stick with it. This is the hard part here, but this is what separates the men from the boys and the women from the girls when it comes down to learning these things, because a lot of people get scared when they see this textbook and this kind of stuff. But if you just get through these simple little things we have here, 6 points, then you're way above 99% of the population. So let's look at 6 kinds of the post hoc errors. There are several different kinds of factors to be taken into account in causal reasoning, and consequently, there are several different and distinctive kinds of post hoc weaknesses, shortcomings, or errors that are important to recognize. So, 1, too few instances. The correlation is based on too few instances to rule out coincidence. 2, there's the reverse causality. Getting the causal relationship backwards. B causes A, not A causes B. Common cause. Overlooking a third factor, C, that causes both A and B. So a common cause, a third factor, the unknown unknown. A complex causal chains for number 4. Overlooking intervening variables between A and B. A causes C indirectly via B. So it's a complex causal chain. Then we have extrapolation beyond range. These are errors here. Causal relationship only holds within a certain range of cases, and they're trying to extrapolate beyond the range where the causal relationship holds. Then there's a bias due to defining variables. Apparent trend is a statistical artifact created by a shift in how variables are defined. So if you start shifting the way you're defining variables, then the statistical output from there, these artifacts, would not be valid. All right, so now we get through that part. Let's see here some examples to make sense of it all. Here's examples for errors 1 and 2, the too few instances. On the fatal night of Doria's collision with the Swedish ship Grisholm off Nantucket in 1956, the lady retired to her cabin and flicked the light switch. Suddenly, there was a great crash and the sound of grinding metal. She flipped the wrong switch. Passengers and crew ran screaming through the passageways. The lady burst from her cabin and explained to the first person in sight that she must have set the ship's emergency brake. Okay. A single instance of correlation leads to a false causal conclusion. Boy, jeez. Then we have the reversed causality. People of a certain island had observed, perfectly accurately, over the centuries, that people in good health have body lice, and people in poor health do not. They had traditionally concluded that lice make a man healthy. The reality is lice avoid sick people with fevers, not that lice cause health. So, very interesting one here of reversed causality. We had numbers 1 and 2, too few instances, reversed causality. Let's move on to number 3, the common cause. It was found that married persons ate less candy than single persons. A second look at the data showed that if married and single individuals of equal age were compared, the correlation vanished. Hence, it would be misleading to conclude that getting married causes less candy consumption in an individual. Age is the operative factor in both increased likelihood of marriage and decreased candy consumption. So we have the common cause error. The initial observation, married people eat less candy. False conclusion, marriage causes less candy consumption. Getting married causes less candy consumption. The reality is age affects both marriage likelihood and candy consumption. So there's a common cause for both of those. They're not the ones causing it. Why it happens? Well, there's pattern recognition leads to causal assumptions. We know about assumptions. There's the confirmation bias. It strengthens the initial conclusion. And of course, the limited perspective misses the hidden variables. We have critical questions here too. What else? What else could explain the correlation besides getting married to eat less candy? Does the correlation hold across different groups? Is there a plausible mechanism for causation? Does this even make sense? So what we have here is the common cause is what influences both A, the marriage, and B, the candy consumption, not A influences B. So you see how that works. A fourth type of errors to overlook, this is the complex causal claims. A chain of linkages in a causal sequence. It may be that A causes C, but that causal relationship between them is more clearly brought out by observing that there is a third causal factor, B, intervening between A and C. The hidden factor, B. So there's an indirect causation. C may be more correctly said to be indirectly caused by A. So C is indirectly caused by A because it goes through B. It's a complex relationship, this chain here. The causal relationship between A and C may be said to be more complex or recursive. The oversimplification fallacy. Failure to appreciate these intervening factors is a kind of fallacy of oversimplification. Let's move along. So here's our examples. The brakes and the fan. A motorist observes that when he applies the brakes, his defroster fan starts to squeak. He concludes that the brakes must somehow be connected to the fan mechanism. I guess he's never worked on his car. So what we have here is the application of brakes results in the deceleration of the car. Acceleration of the car causes the fan tilting. Fan tilting then causes the fan squeaking. So the application of the brakes didn't directly cause the fan squeaking. It had to go through a sequence of events to get to the fan squeaking. So our initial observation, the correlation between braking and fan squeaking, then the assumption of a direct causal connection. That assumption is the problem. That's the error. Complex causal chain is what's really happening to explain what's going on. The intervening variable, the car deceleration. The chain of events, the brakes cause deceleration, cause fan tilt, cause a squeak. So the error is the oversimplification of causal relationship, the fallacy of concluding a direct causation. So it's not a direct, it's a chain of causation. And it's complex causal chain. So by simplifying it, we're not getting to the real problem here. The fan is tilting not because of the brakes, but because of the deceleration of the car after the application of brakes. Another post hoc. Let's move along to the Berkeley admissions, part 1 here. Okay, whatever. It was found by a study of admissions data that the rejection rates were much higher for women than for men at the University of California, Berkeley. The statistical findings seem to indicate the conclusion that being a woman causes one to be rejected at Berkeley. Consequently, Berkeley was accused of discriminating against women. So, let's see how this is done here with our initial observation. There's a statistical correlation between gender and rejection rates. There is higher rejection rates for women than men. So what they're saying here, initial conclusion was a direct causal link assumed between gender and rejection, and discrimination was their initial conclusion from that correlation. The error was oversimplifying the causal model without considering intervening variables. They're missing the factor that explains the correlation. Here we have it. So it starts out with being a woman, applying to a popular department, and then being rejected. So it's not just being a woman gets you rejected. It's being a woman applying to a popular department, meaning a lot of people are applying to this department, so there's going to be a higher rate of rejection. Let's move along here to part 2. However, Bickel, Hommel, and O'Connell in 1977 showed that if you looked at the figures for each of the 85 departments individually, you could see that the probability of admission was just about the same for both sexes, or even somewhat higher for women. What had been overlooked is that women tended to apply for admission to the more popular departments, which also happen to be the departments with the higher rejection rates. So, with department level data, that right stratification of the samples, right? The department level data reveal different pattern. So the department choice was the intervening variable. And a complex causal chain explains the correlation. Doesn't describe it, it explains the correlation. Again, here it is. Being a woman, here's your chain. Applying to a popular department was what they're sampling here. All the women that they were checking, there's so many of them were getting rejected because they were applying to a popular department, not strictly because they were being rejected at Berkeley. So again, it misapplied the cause. So what we have here is the deeper analysis. Department level data revealed a different pattern. There was no discrimination found at the department level. The missing factor was department choice's intervening variable. The popular departments had higher rejection rates and the correlated confusion. The complex causal chain explains the correlation. There was no direct causation between gender and rejection. Berkeley got off the hook. Good thing they had the informal logic professors to help them out. Here's an example. Corn prices and hay fever. A meteorologist discovered that the fall in the price of corn is inversely correlated with the severity of hay fever cases. Should we conclude that there's a causal relationship between the severe case of hay fever and a drop in the price of corn? Two other factors suggest some second thoughts. First, the price of corn tends to be low when the crop is large. Second, where weather conditions favor a bumper crop of corn, they also favor a bumper crop of ragweed. So, corn prices fall, hay fever increases. Are they correlated? Or is there a causality between them? The initial observation, inverse correlation between corn prices and hay fever. Question, is there a causal relationship? So corn prices fall, hay fever increases. Is there a causal relationship? Our first factor here is large corn crop leads to lower prices. So we're looking at a complex chain here. Follow me. We're going to get this all depicted in a second. There's a supply and demand economic principle at hand that links the large crop and price. Next, we have the second factor. The weather conditions affect both crops. Bumper ragweed crop causes more hay fever. So if we have a bumper corn crop, we have a bumper ragweed crop. So then we see that it comes together like this. First, favorable weather for plant growth, a common cause. It leads to a large corn crop, which makes low demand for corn, which makes a drop in the price of the corn. However, the common cause also creates a large ragweed increase, which results directly into an increase in severe hay fever cases. So it combines error 3, the common cause, and error 4, the complex chains. So we have our complex chains and we have our common cause here. The favorable weather is the common cause of both a large corn crop and a large ragweed incidence. The causal chain from weather to corn price involves multiple steps. So the supply and demand adjusting price, right? And large crop because of the weather, large ragweed leads to increase in severe hay fever cases. Simple, isn't it? So we're on a post hoc error 5, extrapolation beyond the range. A fifth type of causal error involves extrapolation beyond a given range of cases. Sometimes there is a positive relationship between two variables A and B within a certain range of cases. But then the relationship falls outside of that range. So you're just picking a range where you find favorable explanation, but beyond that range, the relationship falls. It is often observed that rain is good for the crops. Within a certain range of conditions, this causal relationship holds. The more rain, the better for the crops. But if there is too much rain, it can have a negative effect on crop yields. So some rain, good for crops, nonlinear relationship changes beyond certain threshold, positive correlation within limited range. The error is saying extrapolating beyond that range because the relationship changes beyond a certain threshold, like the monsoons and the floods. It's not good. for the crops. So the misleading conclusion is without specifying the range, how much water is too much, or how much rain is too much. So leads to too much rain is harmful to crops. So the critical questions are, what are the limits of the causal relationship, and does the relationship change at the extremes? Indeed it does. So we're on to the final one, post hoc error 6, bias due to defining variables. The sixth kind of error in arguing from a statistical correlation to a causal conclusion has to do with how the events or items studied in the correlation are classified and defined. The message given out by the media is that we are winning the battle against cancer because early detection and new methods of treatment have resulted in increased survival rates. However, numerous respected researchers have criticized the validity of these statistics. This criticism is based on the contention that the real survival rates may not have changed at all, and that the apparent improvement may only be due to a shift in how cancer patient is defined over the years. So shifting definitions over time is not good for statistics. 6 types of bias in cancer studies. We have lead time bias, length bias, overdiagnosis, patient self-selection, stage migration, and increased reporting of non-fatal cases. So I don't need to go into detail on these. You can see how each of these 6 different kinds of biases can be used to further one argument over another. Here's another example of night lights and myopia. The previous study conducted by researchers at the University of Pennsylvania found that ambient light exposure during sleep at night in the first 2 years of a child's life greatly increased that child's chance of developing myopia. That's nearsightedness. This earlier study showed that the previous study they're talking about here. This is one study talking about a previous study. So we're kind of in the middle of this study here, but there was nothing really before this. But the same study did not take into consideration whether or not parents were nearsighted, according to Zadnik. Her study took into account parental myopia. Researchers noticed that nearsighted parents were more likely to use a nightlight in their child's room. We think this may be due to the parents' own poor eyesight, Zadnik said. Also, Zadnik said that her study found that genetics plays a significant role in causing myopia. So again, we have a common cause. Parental myopia, leading to nightlight usage, and also leading to child's myopia because of the genetics. So the nightlight usage isn't what's doing it. This is our common cause again. So we have the initial study, a correlation between nightlights and myopia. The conclusion was nightlights cause myopia. So that's our initial study, was a correlation. The revised analysis, the common cause, parental myopia. So they discovered the common cause. The genetic factor, parents pass myopia to children. So there's that factor here. The cause of the pass to children. It also causes them to put nightlights up because they have bad vision. The key insight is a hidden variable. Explains the correlation. The complex causation requires careful analysis. Well, who has time for careful analysis? It's so tiresome and boring. However, these key insights here allow you to see through what's hidden. That the nightlight usage isn't causing the myopia, it's the genetics from the parents. So once you add this factor in, it's clear to see the correlation, and the causation is actually the genetics, not the nightlight. So, strengthening causal arguments. Let's look at some ways we can do that. How can an argument from correlation to causation be made stronger? So the way of strengthening our arguments here, the proponent of the argument can strengthen it by responding to or taking account of these 7 types of critical questions. So basically preparing shields here for the questions that are inevitabilities of a good questioner that's familiar with informal logic, I would assume. So, the 7 critical questions. Is there a positive correlation? Positive correlation between A and B. So that's the first thing. Is there a positive correlation? Well, yes. Okay, well, then we go to 2. Is there a significant number of instances of the correlation? So we have made the causation as a correlation. Now we want to know about, is it a one-off, or is it something that we could establish some type of statistical regularity to? Then, is there good evidence that the causal relationship goes from A to B, not B to A? So what kind of good evidence we have that it's indeed what you're claiming causes B isn't the cause of B? And then 4, can it be ruled out that the correlation is due to a common cause? So have you done the careful analysis to discover the common cause if it does exist? 5, if there are intervening variables, can the indirect relationship be shown? So again, with the common cause or intervening variables, can you show that that indirect relationship? For instance, the genetics of the parents causing the child myopia, not the use of the nightlight. If the connection fails to hold outside a certain range, can the limits be indicated, as with rainfall? It's too much rainfall, no longer good, but up to that point it is good. So the correlation fails to hold. This is how we establish the causation or the causalities. So can it be shown that the change in B is not solely due to how B is defined? So is it shifting definitions, giving us false conclusions? So these are 7 critical questions that would be used to dissect any kind of argument of causation. And if you are making that kind of argument, you can strengthen it by addressing these beforehand so that they don't have to be brought forward. They're basically nipped in the bud, so to speak. Let's proceed. Stick in here because we're getting close to the end. We'll have a quiz. If all 7 critical questions are answered, then an investigator may be able to say in practical terms that in all plausibility, A is the cause of B. But the causal hypothesis cannot be conclusively confirmed with scientific precision until more is known about the underlying theory of the linkage between A and B. So here we have a really nice one here as field-dependent relation. So understanding causation as a field-dependent relationship. So we have here A is the cause. This is the initial factor that initiates the causal process. Okay, and we have B, the effect, the result of that causal process. And we have I, an intervening factor. It mediates between the cause and effect. And we have the field, the context, or the conditions that enable the causation. So here we have this field, and we have the cause into the field and the effect over here after the field. But this field is almost like a black box. Until it's defined, it's unknown what's going on here because you also have intervening factors. So if you can, this actually mediates the effect of the cause. So until this is defined, the I, the intervening factor, and how it acts within this field here, the context or conditions that enable the causation, enable A to affect B. Now on to post hoc criticisms as critical questions. Very important here. Instead of putting down an argument by condescendingly claiming that it commits a post hoc fallacy, it is more constructive to raise specific questions about the strength of the argument from the correlation to the causal conclusion. So take a constructive approach. Post hoc criticisms as critical questions rather than refutations. Use the starting points. Initial correlations suggest causal links are inquiry beginnings. not final conclusions. There's an evolving understanding. New data reveals other factors, leading to more complex causal models. And the intellectual honesty, insisting on a simple initial conclusions despite new evidence, becomes a fallacy. So, very gentle terms there, but you can see the critical questions. Here's an example here. Pet companionship. At a conference on the bond between humans and pets in Boston in 1986, researchers reported that their pets can lower blood pressure in humans, can provide the survival odds of heart patients, and can even penetrate the isolation of autistic children. According to a report in Newsweek, Sharon Begley and Karen Fitzgerald wrote the book Freud Should Have Been Barking, September 1st, 1986, pages 65-66. Researchers at the conference reported on the beneficial effects of pet companionship. Studies showed that women who had owned dogs as children scored higher on self-reliance, sociability, and tolerance tests than petless women. Petless women. Men who had owned a dog felt a greater sense of personal worth and of belonging, and had better social skills. Now it's from page 66. Children with pets also showed greater empathy. So what they're claiming here, physical health, that pets companionship, it lowers blood pressure and better heart patient survival. It gives psychological benefits such as greater self-worth and enhanced belonging, and social development, better social skills, and increased empathy, according to their book. However, we're here to do the criticism and ask the hard, critical questions. Here's our causal questions. Do pets cause these benefits? Or do people with certain traits choose pets? Is it just the nice people who pick pets?
Bill Simmons 4426 says sicker people might find it more difficult to keep pets.
Exactly. That's one of the things there. There's so many variables here that are not being considered from that book. So we have these potential errors. The reversed causality is a possibility. What we just said here. Do people with certain traits choose the pets? And we have the common cause, a nurturing personality. Then we get over to the critical evaluation. The controlled studies are needed for confirmation. And as Bill Thomas pointed out, multiple factors are likely at play. We could go on naming these all day long. So as I say here, the way of taking these causal questions and the critical evaluation is important rather than attacking it. Oh, it's post hoc fallacy. Now on to another example of liver and pernicious anemia. Again, just as a disclaimer, none of this is to be used or construed or abused as any kind of medical health advice at all, and just don't do this at home. Whatever you do, it's strictly for the educational entertainment purposes of the review of this text. Let's proceed. In 1925, pernicious anemia was a fatal disease that caused affected people to die because their bones mysteriously failed to produce red blood cells. By 1926, Dr. George R. Minot had found through clinical experience that feeding large quantities of liver to 45 of his patients with pernicious anemia was followed by a great increase in red corpuscle count in each one. Moreover, each of these patients stated feeling better and, when kept on a diet of liver, survived to continue a healthy life. So in 1925, it was a fatal disease. The bones failed to produce red blood cells. Scientific method used clinical observation of correlation, did a controlled testing with 45 patients. So in 1926, Dr. Minot's discovery, liver treatment, meaning eating liver, increased the red blood corpuscles. There's a causal reasoning now, the consistent results across all patients. No exceptions. Multiple indicators of improvement. So he's making some causal reasoning here. The result, the patient survived. Continued liver diet maintains health. Key strengths: significant sample size, 45 patients, and long-term follow-up confirms sustained effects. This makes you want to have some liver and onions about now, doesn't it? All right, let's proceed. So we got into our summary here of statistical arguments. Many common generalizations and causal claims are based on inductive and statistical arguments. If these arguments are carefully constructed using scientific methods of experimental verification, it may take a specialized statistical knowledge to properly evaluate them. So you always just need to ask, what is the evidence for statistical claims? You don't have to be the statistical expert. Just ask, what is the evidence? Question, if samples are inadequate or biased. You can easily see if it's too small a sample size once they present the evidence. Challenge the vague terms. Those are the meaningless statistics. And impossible verification, which are unknowable statistics. So two kinds here, the meaningless statistics from vague terms, no meaning, vague without enough meaning, and impossible, unknowable statistics, impossible verification. Scrutinize the exact wording of survey questions. So when they're asking you questions, survey the exact wording. Look for those ones that are slanted emotionally and loaded, especially. All right, so on our key takeaways, I hope you're paying attention. We're about to do the quiz here. Inductive reasoning is probabilistic, not certain, like deductive reasoning. Statistical arguments require careful evaluation of sampling, definitions, and data collection methods. So if you're not a statistician, probably those statistics, that argument probably isn't meant for you unless they're presenting you with full transparency of the methods and all the evidence used for constructing their statistical argument. Then the causal arguments from correlation are plausible but must be strengthened by answering critical questions. So the arguments as they are may be plausible, but they must be strengthened. Remember, strength of the argument in inductive reasoning, not validity as in deductive reasoning. So it's not a certainty or an absolute, but a probability and a degree. So you can strengthen it by answering critical questions. Those critical questions really strengthen the whole causal argument. Like with the doctor, every single one of his patients felt better after eating liver. So it's a critical question that really helps strengthen the causal argument. There's no exception. There's a highlighting biases and fallacies improves critical thinking and decision making, which is very dangerous. Then there's a critical questioning is more constructive than dismissing arguments as fallacious, which is always more convenient and emotionally satisfying. However, the critical questioning is more constructive. All right, which takes us to the quiz. This is going to be simple. It's multiple choice to make it easy for everyone. So we just went over this. Which type of error occurs when a statistical claim uses a vague term with a precise figure? So we're using a vague term with a precise figure. Vague is the key one here. What does it mean when something is vague? It's not very clear what it means, right? Anyone wants to pipe up there in the chat, you could just type the letter. All right, we'll move on to number 2. After this, therefore, because of this, describes which type of reasoning error. Come on, this is an easy one. Number 2.
Built-in 4426 says A.
All right, that's well noted. I can't go to the answers quite yet. So you put A for number 1. All right, what do you put for number 2 here? After this, therefore, because of this. After this, therefore, because of this, describes which type of reasoning error. Come on, this is an easy one. This is our fallacy we've been talking about here. Next is number 3. In the Berkeley admissions example, remember with the women saying that they were being discriminated against. What was the intervening variable?
Built-in 4426 says capital C.
All right, so you're saying reverse causality for number 2? Or for number 3? Number 3 is C, you're saying. I'll say number 3 is C. You skip 2.
Built-in 4426 says, I meant B for 2.
Okay, B for 2, C for 3. Good. And number 4, what approach is more constructive than dismissing arguments as fallacious? Ignoring the argument, critical questioning, accepting without analysis, or changing the subject. This one's pretty straightforward and simple here. The more constructive we just went over should be pretty clear to see. It's not ignoring, it's not accepting without analysis, and it's definitely not changing the subject. All right, so everyone's got their answers in here. We're going to move along and get to the cheat sheet here. And come on, load up. What's going to make us wait, huh? There we go. All right, here's our quiz answers. Uh-oh. So number 1, remember,
Built-in 4426 says, questioning final answer.
Yeah, that was fine. So we have here, the only problem is number 1, it's the meaningless statistic. So again, this is A, and I think we got that one right there for, was it A? Yeah, it was A. Yeah, meaningless, because it's without a meaning. When it's vague, it's without meaning. Thought I had the questions along with it here. Oh yeah, here it is. Yeah, which type of error occurs? So the precise figures with vague terms creates a false precision, like the 90% of major racketeers. It's meaningless. It's too vague. Without vague, there's no clear meaning. So number 2 was after this, therefore, because of this, describes, of course, the post hoc fallacy, assuming causation from correlation alone without considering other factors. That's the post hoc fallacy. In the Berkeley admissions example, the intervening variable that explained the correlation was indeed the department choice. So women applied to more competitive departments with higher rejection rates. So number 4, what approach is more constructive than dismissing arguments as fallacious? And since we've been through this presentation today, we should know exactly how and why. The critical questioning, asking specific questions about evidence, strengthens arguments rather than rejecting them. And conversely, it also will weaken the ones that can't withstand the critical questioning, so they won't have to be attacked for just being simply fallacious. So with that said, thank you. And Bill Thomas, you scored 100, so you get the gold medal for that. Indeed. Oh, there it is. And your answers are staying up there the whole time. I didn't even realize here because I was looking at a different screen. That said, I would like to thank everyone for showing up here and participating in today's presentation.
Built-in 4426 says from quiz.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. I definitely did too. And going through in here and preparing something like this is really fun to do in a way too, because it's taking something that's really difficult and put in a way that's very inaccessible for most people, but the topic itself isn't so inaccessible. It's actually very prevalent in our day-to-day lives, just heavily overlooked. And I think you bring back a little bit more attention to the real purposes and the reasons why informal logic applies in our day-to-day transactions so importantly, and prevents a lot of pitfalls, I think is lacking a lot in not just the educational system, but in just our basic interactions in general within society. So more informal logic, I think the better everyone can get along, and less deceit and less harm can be caused. With that said, I'd like to thank you all for coming in and participating on this one. I think we have only one more chapter and we'll have actually completed this graduate level text on informal logic. So I thank you all for being here. Salute to you all, and we'll see you on the next one. Peace out.
Built-in 4426 says, take care all.